Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you're watching this from. On behalf of Nepal Institute of International Cooperation and Engagement and Water Policy Center, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all. I extend a very warm welcome to our distinguished chair, Dr. Deepak Prakash Bhatt, speakers and participants registered for the event. We're glad that you could join us today at the NIICE WPC International Conference on Post-Pandemic World Order, Navigating the New Normal. Throughout the 3 days conference, we will be having 30 sessions that will take place at 2 Zoom rooms simultaneously. We have around 150 experts and speakers joining us from 30 different countries who will be delivering their presentations and sharing their expertise with us. This is the 11th session of the conference. To chair and moderate this session, it's a real pleasure to have Mr. Deepak Prakash Bhatt with us. Dr. Deepak Prakash Bhatt, founding chairperson of Nepal Center for Security Governance, holds a PhD from the School of International Studies, JNU, Delhi. He has served as a member of the Technical Committee and Secretariat of the Special Committee for Supervision, Integration, and Rehabilitation of Maoist Army Combatants from March 2009 to December 2012. He is a faculty member at the Masters in Development Studies, DCPDS, and Institute of Crisis Management, ICMS, Tribhuvan University. In addition, he is a visiting professor at Armed Police Force Command and Staff College, Kathmandu. The cherry on the cake remains his publications in books, newspapers, and magazines. Without further ado, sir, please take the session forward.
Thank you, Paki. Thank you, Pramod. Dr. Pramod, it's a very honored to be here chairing the session and having a Augustus panel and gathering. Good morning and good afternoon, whatever suits you, friends. And first of all, I would like to thank NIICE and WPC team, which has managed this mega event, webinar, connecting hundreds of scholars, academicians, journalists, and researchers, and the people, those who have been contributing from different parts of the world, enriching sharing the knowledge culture. And as the panel, you have seen the scholars here. Professor Swaran Singh, he's a professor in CPOD, Center for International Politics, Organizations and the Disarmament in JNU, SIS. Dr. Shambhu Simkhada, and Professor Swaran Singh will be speaking on the topic, the very interesting, fascinating, and very in-depth in sense of looking at from the strategic point of view, reading post-COVID-19 China, what Sanjay tells us. So a military strategist which has contributed in a great effort to the Chinese society and the world in military thinking and the military strategy, Sanjay, what Sanjay tells us. So he will be talking from that perspective, Professor Swaran Singh. And Dr. Shambhu Simkhada, a colleague of mine, worked together in a special committee, and it's a secretariat and the technical committee which was formed in the leadership of the Prime Minister, under the leadership of the Prime Minister. And we got a chance to work with the 4 Prime Ministers in that special committee. Was formed for the integration of the Maoist army, the People's Liberation Army created by Maoist party, the rebel party, and integration into the national army, Nepal army, the then Royal Nepalese Army, and then Nepal army, Nepali army. And he has served as an ambassador to the UN, Geneva, and he had chaired Human Rights Committee at that point. And now he is a member of the National Defense University, a new project launched by government of Nepal, and a very big achievement for the government and Nepal and the strategic community of Nepal, establishing National Defense University. And he is heading the subcommittee which will delve on the infrastructure and development issues. And he will be speaking on the search for a new or the pushback to the old, the post-pandemic world order. And Professor Sanjay Kumar Bhardwaj, my supervisor, my mentor, a professor in SIS, JNU, South Asian Studies. He will be speaking on the Indian foreign policy in emerging world order. As we see, the world order is definitely, people are talking about changing or, maybe in a conjunction or in a flux. And he will be speaking on India's foreign policy component. And after that, a good friend of mine, Professor Shahab, he is a professor of international relations, and he has been extensively writing and speaking on the issues related to the South Asian security, South Asian cooperation, and this morning he will be speaking in regional cooperation in post-COVID world order. As we see world order in terms of development model, scholars and academicians and researchers and the policymakers all are closely watching. Is this going to the world is entering into a new world, Cold War, new world order, or something like that? And people are talking and looking from the different continent, region, sub-region, and country specific perspective. And at the same time, people are talking from unipolar world to the multipolar world or the bipolar world again. And again, people are talking about and looking and dealing with the regional risk and risks in the bilateral and the multilateral forums created like BRICS, or some other BIMSTEC, whatever it is, BBIN or BCIM, whatever is coined in the last 20 to 30 years, or ASEAN or EU, or many things we have seen. And in the biggest achievement of the 19th and the 20th century is, as we have seen, the nation building or the nation state phenomena. Now that is again, is it shifting in a new era with the projection of Belt and Road Initiative by China, a global strategy, and Indo-Pacific, from rebalancing Asia-Pacific to Indo-Pacific strategy of the US. And in that context, and different scholars have talked about clash of civilizations, clash of, and domination of the identity politics to now the populism and challenges posed by populist agenda or the populism to the established democracy. And as I mentioned, the development model of the world from China to India, and of course from US, Europe, and China to India. So that is the whole gamut of the discourse now. But again, I'm very happy and honored and thankful to NIICE and WPC team and Dr. Pramod, as you have connected scholars and contributors, policymakers throughout the world, and they are in this forum. So welcome, Professor Sanjay Kumar Bhardwaj. Sir, namaskar. It's my pleasure. I have introduced you as a panelist, and
Thank you, Dr. Deepak. Be honored to chaired by you.
Thank you, sir. It's my privilege and honor as I have introduced all the panelists, and as I have said, how post-pandemic world order is to navigate, and I'm sure that all the scholarly presentations and as all you have been digging the issues for a quite long time. So without delay, I will give floor to the Professor Swaran Singh. He will be speaking on the, as I mentioned earlier, reading post-COVID-19 world through and analyzing and discussing his understanding about the post-COVID-19 world from what Sun Tzu tells us. So, Professor Swaran Singh, now it's floor to you.
Thank you, Honorable Chair Dr. Deepak Prakash Bhatt. Also, great congratulations to my dear friend Dr. Pramod Jaiswal, Research Director of NIICE or NICE. Post-COVID world order and how are we navigating the new normal. The way Pramod has been organizing these splash of seminars is a reflection in itself as to how equations during and post-COVID-19 are going to be completely reset, and what are going to be the measures of wielding or seeking influence at various levels, including in international relations. At center of this navigating of new normal remains People's Republic of China, which was really emerging as a system-shaping power even before COVID-19. But at least Chinese believe that COVID-19 has given them a kind of a boost or leapfrog in terms of their economic prowess, at least, which they have been trying over a period of time to convert into political influence. So in navigating new normal, I assume understanding of Chinese behavior remains a very significant component of what will be new normal and how all of us will be navigating the new normal. Two things are interesting when we look at China. One, the claim that Chinese have that they have already come out of COVID-19, and that makes them a very special influencer during and post-COVID-19. And second element, which the world has been talking about, of China's increasing assertiveness. And I'm intentionally using a very, very neutral word here, assertiveness across the periphery, all the way from South China Sea to Indian borders in the western sector in Ladakh. So in this, during and post-COVID-19, when China is at center of global debate, these two things are perhaps most important to understand. How and why and have really Chinese come out of COVID-19? And what explains this acceleration in their such assertive behavior across the periphery? And I'm going to look at this from what my own teacher, Professor Thanchung, used to talk about geo-civilizational perspective, not geostrategic, geoeconomic. There is too much debate on geoeconomic, geostrategic components of China's influencer role in global affairs. And if we look at China's two claims or two behaviors, one of trying to behave as if there is no more COVID-19 for them. Second, trying to behave that as if they can now assert and achieve in their immediate periphery something that they always aspired for, but perhaps were restrained and could not do that so far. And if we try to look at geo-civilizational lens to understand that behavior, Sun Tzu perhaps becomes very central character again. To understand why is such a behavior visible and can we fathom and understand that behavior a little better. When we talk of Sun Tzu, we talk of a very important book called The Art of War, which of course most authors believe that, most experts believe that was authored by multiple people. So Sun Tzu becomes a kind of an institution. Just like similar claims are also made about Shakespeare, for example, that there was no one individual writing that whole literature. So Sun Tzu was not known until about 100 or 150 years ago to the rest of the world. It's only for the first time French translation happened in late 19th century. But the world came to know much about it only when the English translation appeared in 1910. And that was a translation by Leonard Giles. During the Vietnam War, that became a Bible in United States, because in 1963, another translation by Samuel Griffith arrived, and since both Ho Chi Minh and Mao Zedong treated Art of War as a Bible, Americans really made it important in all their military academies to understand Art of War, to understand the mindset of Chinese and therefore of the Viet Cong guerrillas. The most latest translation of Art of War has appeared from Princeton University PhD, someone called Michael Nyla. And in that translation, she makes a very important point. She believes that the entire treatise of Art of War is predicated on the idea that there will be bad luck and that it will come your way and it will keep coming quite regularly. What you do not want it to come from, the bad luck, is from your lack of planning. So you understand Sun Tzu is emphasizing on advanced planning of life. And in the 13 chapters of Art of War, repeatedly that element, while addressing different components of war, is emphasized that advanced planning is important. Second very significant element that explains China's behavior is that many people think it's a treatise on art of war and would be therefore aimed at clear victory. Many people quote Sun Tzu to say armies should walk into the theater only for celebrations, because people who follow Sun Tzu will hollow their enemy without fighting a battle. Or another quotation from Art of War, to fight 100 battles and to win 100 battles is not acme of skill, but to win 100 battles without fighting any of them is acme of skill. So you have to weaken your enemy without actually fighting a direct war. You can see China's behavior right from the periphery that they really took over soon after liberation of China to right up to the behavior vis-a-vis Taiwan as of yesterday. Important element that explains here is that Art of War says that long-term planning is aimed at long-term victory. And in long-term victory, they talk about political war, not military war. So China is focused on winning a political war. And sometimes we keep looking at China's behavior in terms of military strategy, military outcomes, how are they responding to sort of certain successes or failures on military skirmishes with any of the neighbors. Indeed, Art of War even goes to the extent of saying that at appropriate time, even negotiations can be held, where neither side will have a sense of what it called stunning victory. Now, these are things that become alive in United States in the debates on limited nuclear war. Henry Kissinger, Robert Osgood, and several other people did work in late 1950s, 1960s. But Sun Tzu was talking about it in 6th century BC, in Wu Kingdom. And that time, Chinese kingdoms were fighting exactly like 18th, 19th century European countries were fighting religious wars. So Sun Tzu, among other things, talks here that if you think that there is no danger to you because there is no present danger in front of your eyes, this is about as stupid a move you could possibly make as you could. So you understand how Mao Zedong in so sometimes China's behavior is defeats or victories that China has had, but Chinese are not aiming themselves in fighting a military victory or defeat, but the political victory or defeat is more significant. And when it talks about 9 contingencies in chapter 8, it underlines the fact, and Sun Tzu says, do not count on the enemy not coming. Depend instead on your side being prepared to confront him as and when he shows up. Now, if you look at this in terms of how Chinese have been preparing over a period of time with the 4 modernizations of Deng Xiaoping, where military is the last 4th element of their modernization. Sustaining that modernization through earlier first 3 modernizations is significant. Chapter 5 says something really interesting here. It says clever combatant looks to the effects of combined sh, which is energy. So clever combatant, he says, looks at the effects of combined sh developed by good fighting men as in the momentum of a round stone rolled down from mountain thousands feet high. So, 2 things. 1, Chinese look at political war. Second, they look at the multiple elements delivering together as an outcome, not a singular component delivering its outcome. So when we talk, for example, of a lot of people are questioning today, why are Chinese opening multiple fronts across their periphery? When the whole world seems to be angry with them, at least the Western world seems to be angry with them. They need to go back to Sun Tzu, who says multiple fronts can be opened vis-a-vis one particular enemy, because aim is political victory, not the battles on the front. And therefore, United States is the singular sole adversary or enemy that Chinese are fighting today, and all rest of the countries in the periphery of China are nothing more than friends and allies and cohorts of the United States. And therefore, their angst, anger, aggression, or assertion in the periphery is part of what Wang Yi recently said, the new Cold War. And that is where you have to understand the focus of Deng Xiaoping on comprehensive national strength. So in that sense, the behavior of assertion of China, the behavior of advanced planning of China, for example, lot of controversies about how WHO has been manipulated by Chinese. But if you go back to the SARS of 2002-2003, when there was a European politician who was heading World Health Organization, Brundtland, I suppose, if I remember right, had declared advisories on travel to China without consulting China. So that was seen as a Western way, at least the Chinese read it as a Western way of undermining China, without giving China a chance to negotiate and engage. So Chinese learned their lessons and started planning. And therefore, following from 2006 to 2016, for a full decade, it was a Chinese doctor who was Director General of World Health Organization, and influenced not just the leadership of WHO, but influenced the processes and structures of this organization such that China will have an opportunity to engage and explain its position in case SARS gets repeated in future. So when COVID-19 happened, media is now talking of the influence the Chinese wielded in selection of Dr. Tedros, an Ethiopian leader, as Director General of WHO. That's again not a singular proposition to make. Chinese have been wielding influence across all organs and agencies of United Nations. Today, 4 major agencies out of 15 of United Nations are headed by Chinese. Till recently, for a full decade, I said WHO was headed by a Chinese doctor. So sometimes that incremental, imperceptive, piecemeal wielding and expanding of Chinese influence is what need to be understood, rather than saying, oh, WHO was being manipulated by Chinese from December. That's not how it happened. It's an ongoing, gradual, piecemeal process. And therefore, I think the way we understand Chinese behavior, both in terms of controlling COVID-19, overcoming COVID-19, or at least demonstrating that they have overcome COVID-19, as also their behavior in terms of their expanded, accelerated assertion on the border has to be understood in geo-civilizational sense. And my last component to explain this would be what Sun Tzu, if Sun Tzu was sitting today with us and was talking about what is happening and how to explain this unusual example of Chinese 1.4 billion people being able to manage COVID-19 with such limited damage. And also what explains this across the periphery and of course with the United States is constant assertive behavior of China. He would perhaps go back to something that is civilizationally widespread in Chinese society. The game of Go. In fact, in Chinese, it is called I Go. And people often compare it with chess. Most people believe chess was originated in India, and I Go, the game, which most people play, old people even today play all over China, this game of I Go. They look similar games. They are both on board. There are pieces on the board. But I think that will help us understand how civilizationally, I'm speaking from India, how India and Chinese mindset works. And chess and I Go are a fantastic comparison to understand that mindset. And Sun Tzu would perhaps use that to understand. Both are board-based games with multiple pieces on top of it. Both also have black and white pieces on top of it. But that's where similarity ends. Chess has 16 pieces, black and white, sitting and playing on 64 squares. I Go has 19 pieces. Now, difference is in case of chess, the hierarchy and discipline of the pieces is clearly demonstrated, is known, is established. There could be some surprises. For example, a pawn goes and enters opponent's king's seat, it becomes the king. But that's a surprise at end of the outcome, towards the end of the outcome. So hierarchy is well defined in chess. Discipline is well defined in chess. In I Go, 19 stones on both sides are sitting on a bigger board with roughly about 361 points. Now, unlike chess, where each piece sits inside a square, relatively safe inside square, in I Go, these little stones sit on the crossing points, influencing 4 squares at the same time. And therefore, their intention also is different. Intention is in chess is to either checkmate, which is capture, or kill. But that's not the intention in I Go. Intention in I Go is sustain your liberty and undermine your opponent and not allow the opponent to come in the periphery. So where in chess we are trying to kill and achieve a clear victory, in I Go it is constantly building of a kind of a sequence of stones which is not aimed at harming, killing others, opponents' pieces, but to capturing the territory, larger space on that board. And the winner is declared based on the last stone capturing bigger territory.
Professor Swaran, so I will request here you to wrap up your presentation.
In 30 seconds, sir.
Thank you.
So fundamentally, both at the geo-civilizational level, when you look at how the great philosophers like Sun Tzu explain Chinese behavior and mindset, as also at the most mundane level of common people playing I Go, and I compared it to chess to highlight the difference. The Chinese mindset has to be understood very differently, and most of us in the English-speaking world, guided by Anglo-Saxon intellectuals, perhaps are looking at the wrong tree to understand the Chinese behavior. And if we have to understand the new normal, where China is sitting at the center and is going to be far more influential than it has been before. And we want to navigate in the new normal, as the theme of this 3-day seminar is. We perhaps need to understand both the intellectual scholarly mindset and the common man's mindset to understand the Chinese behavior, both in terms of controlling, achieving, and asserting that they are out of COVID-19, and also their newfound enthusiasm, emboldened behavior of what West is calling wolf warriors. What explains that behavior? Once we try to understand it from geo-civilizational perspective, perhaps we'll be better prepared to navigate the new normal, as your theme says. Thank you, Chair, for being a little indulgent with me. I think I took a minute extra.
Thank you, Professor. As Professor Swaran Singh, thank you for your extensive presentation, as you have been taking on the Chinese development in terms of strategic or the military or the geo-civilizational, as you are talking about that particular sense, which is rarely used in Western academia or the research community. What I found, 5th century BC, what Sun Tzu tells to the world or the Chinese civilization is still valid in each and every dimensions of Chinese civilization. That is, from the military thinking to business and of course their lifestyle. And 5th century BC, yes, also South Asian context or Indian context, scholars stress Chanakya for his contribution to the strategic, area, but for eastern region, and Sun Tzu has influenced all that thinking, and about more than 2,000 plus years, that particular the treaties have been aloof from rest of the world, but thanks to the translators from John Joseph to the scholars Naila, Nguyen, all these have contributed a lot, and we can see now how Sun Tzu has contributed not only to the art of war, and how the rest of the world and Chinese thinking is different. And as you have rightly pointed out, what Sun Tzu tells us in his the composed book, as you said, it may be single person to make the treatise that, and maybe many scholars or many military thinkers have contributed to that, and it has opened our understanding about the geo-civilizational contribution. And as I was mentioning briefly, some people talked about the clash of civilizations, and now in terms of development strategy, people are talking about the clash of development model, the West and now the Chinese model. So that is another. And now I will introduce Dr. Shambhu Simkhada. I have introduced him earlier, but now I will give it to the floor to the Dr. Simkhada, Ambassador Simkhada is talking on the world order, post-pandemic world order, and search for a new or the pushback to the old. The big dilemma or the confrontation, how the world will be navigating in this post-pandemic scenario. So doctors, without any delay, I will hand over floor to the Dr. Ambassador Simkhada.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm absolutely delighted to be participating in this discussion. And of course, a great pleasure to speak immediately after a dear friend and a very well-known scholar, Professor Singh. Mr. Chairman, I find the timing and of course the sequencing of the speaking schedule absolutely wonderful, because Professor has spoken about Sun Tzu, and of course I will be making a lot of reference in terms of this dilemma between whether there is going to be a rush back to the same old order, or in fact, are we really looking for a new order? Mr. Chairman, during the long lockdown, going through old collection of my books and papers, I found two fascinating articles I collected as a student of international relations in the United States in the 1980s. At the height of the last Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. One, Choosing a Strategy for World War III by Thomas Powers, a renowned American historian, and the other, Designing the Next Century by a German physicist philosopher, Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, who later also became president of Germany. On different subjects, there is a common thread making both articles relevant for today, as China replaces the former Soviet Union in the new Cold War with the US. About the previous Cold War, Powers, the historian, writes, and I'm quoting Mr. Chairman, when deterrence failed in 1940, the war that followed was awful beyond precedent. But it ended as wars traditionally do, with victory on one side, defeat on the other. This is not the way the war would end if deterrence failed today, end of quote. The physicist von Weizsäcker, supporting the historian Powers, writes, and I'm again quoting, after a nuclear war, none of our dreams for the 21st century would have any meaning, end of quote. Today, there are simulations on conventional naval warfares. Some even I have observed during the wonderful program that Dr. Jaiswal has organized in his own forum very recently. There are debates about blockades and counterbusters in South China Sea, the Taiwan Straits, and of course the major choke points around the Indian Ocean. But can one predict the nature and consequences of a US-China war? History's biggest significance, Mr. Chairman, is learning its lessons. That is what makes understanding of history a vital part of the study and practice of international relations. In this assembly of scholars, which the organizers called Kumbha, very rightly, of some practitioners, mostly scholars, some practitioners, a political leader like yourself, Mr. Chairman, and a few like me on both sides of scholarship and diplomacy. I want to start with a question which has been stirring my mind as a student, teacher, and practitioner of international relations. With their long history of wars and conflicts, scholars today say that a war between and among the major European great powers of yesterday and some today, like Germany, France, Italy, Austria, Spain, and Portugal, is not only improbable, but unthinkable. Can we say the same thing about some of the other great powers of today? US, China, Russia, or China, India, Japan? And if not, my question to all involved in both the study and practice of international relations today, Mr. Chairman, is why not? What prevents these great powers from evolving out of the traditional, what I would call hegemonic and conflictual polarity, enter into a new stage of cooperative and competitive plurality, consistent with the dynamics of time and technology? Seeking answer to this question is the most critical part of IR scholarship and diplomacy if they are to contribute to the preservation and upliftment of humankind and not let obsession with power and profit, inflict pain and sorrow on common humanity, as often experienced at different times of history. Although relevant today, this is not a new question, Mr. Chairman. In different ways, this is a question Edward Hallett Carr, in the 20 Years Crisis, an introduction to the study of international relations. One of the first books on the subject was asking, while analyzing the causes and consequences of the two world wars, starting from Europe and engulfing the whole world. Professor Stanley Hoffman at Harvard warned those celebrating the supposed end of the Cold War as the end of history. And I myself, in a lecture to the class of new officers of Nepal's Ministry of Foreign Affairs in February 1994, and subsequently many places beyond, have been asking, do we really know what the often repeated rhetoric, end of the Cold War, really means? And if not, and if the present trends continue, what is the guarantee it will not be replaced by a new Cold War, with its epicenter moving from Europe and the transatlantic to closer to home? Sometimes, Mr. Chairman, a thinker wishes what he thought, said, or wrote at one stage of history turns out to be untrue. Sadly, things cannot be wished away. When not just politics and diplomacy, but scholarship too becomes prisoner of history, rather than learning and teaching its lessons. That is when the world keeps repeating again and again what it vows never again. As one such blunders, we are now told US-China Cold War is already here. And if they don't change their modes of behavior, the Thucydides trap, believed to have compelled two Greek city-states before even the modern calendar started, makes two nuclear powers of the 21st century. I quote the title, Destined for War. As I wrote in my latest piece in US-China Destined for War, ? Do we know what the consequences, what US-China war can do to the hopes and dreams of not just the Americans and the Chinese, but the whole humankind, and why avoiding it is the central question in contemporary study and practice of international relations. In one of the best books on the life of Mahatma Gandhi, Louis Fisher writes about the partition of India, and I'm quoting, Jinnah's strength was the threat of civil war. Gandhi, the towering symbol of unifying nationalism, was himself a mingling of an obsolete past, a struggling present, and the unborn world of his high ideals. End of quote. The world, Mr. Chairman, today struggles to comprehend the real nature and causes and consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. To find cure and deal with the devastating consequences, I see the need to revisit all assumptions on which we have based our theories and practices.
Dr. Simkhada, I'll just remind you for wrapping up your presentation. You have,
Mr. Chairman, was I
minutes. Yeah.
given
You have 3 minutes. Yeah.
15 minutes?
Yeah, you have 3 minutes. Just allowing you. You have 3 minutes.
So the world today struggles to comprehend the real nature of this pandemic, primarily in many areas, but most significantly on the nature of power and how it is exercised, making many the traditional assumptions of what makes a country powerful, sometimes powerless. So, Mr. Chairman, inspired by this vision, Gandhian vision of an unborn world of high ideals, in the search for a new world order that I call competitive and cooperative plurality, I see the centrality of India in moderating the two extremes. Now, can India rise to the occasion? What role India decides to play, in my view, will largely influence what the global craft, trying to navigate in the cloudy ocean of post-COVID-19 world, moves, rush back to the same old, or search for a real new, where humanity coexists in peace with itself and Mother Nature. In turn, what role India plays will also depend on the situation in the immediate neighborhood, especially the way the most powerful in this region, which India considers its main competitor, but also could also be a partner in peace, security, and transformative global politics, also plays. This is where I see the uniqueness and the importance of Nepal-India relation. For if these two neighbors, interlinked by multiple bonds of history, geography, politics, economic, culture, and security, cannot find the true essence of their closeness, it is difficult to imagine which other two countries can find this relationship in the new post-COVID-19 world order. Mr. Chairman, post-COVID-19, in my view, is both an opportunity and a warning to humanity to change its ways or be forced to change. There is a sloka in one of the Puranas where it says, Jale Vishnu Thale Vishnu, Vishnu Parvata Mastake, Jwalamala Kule Vishnu, Sarvam Vishnu Jagat Meham. In other words, God exists in all creations of nature, whether animate or inanimate. Today, we are still struggling to comprehend what caused the COVID-19 pandemic, how long it will last, and how we will deal with it. One is clear that, in fact, human behavior, in terms of how we behave individually, how our institutions behave, and how the most powerful of the institution human mind created to govern itself, called the nation state, behaves. And unless they change, I'm afraid there might be future pandemics forcing us to change our behavior. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Simkhada. Thank you for your extensive presentation. In fact, you are again recalling the 50th century scholar, statistician, a real political, this political scientist word, though we rarely used for him, who has contributed a lot in terms of strategy again, a historian who has written a book called The History of the Peloponnesian War, where he's talking about the writers like Graham T. Allison is bringing him into the new Cold War discourse or the two-sided trap in terms of, Sparta, Athens context, that how US or the remaining existing superpower will be challenged by upcoming one, something like that. And what you are talking about, always the great powers have accepted, the projected the claims in a newer, upcoming scenario, and the standards they have tried to maintain may not work, because in a scientific way of analyzing the history, as you have rightly pointed out, that yes, the challenges and the prospects are there in this particular scenario of this pandemic, and it's that the world order or the world politics will be moving towards the new, or is the rush back to the old? You have given your insights and what you have been talking for many years and like that. And now with this, I will give floor to the Professor Sanjay Kumar Bhardwaj, my supervisor, my mentor, and as always, he has been talking about how India, and as he is going to speak on India's foreign policy, Indian foreign policy in emerging world order. He has been writing and speaking about how Indian institutions or the foreign policy making process is going on, and so he will be analyzing post-pandemic world order and navigating the new normal and making of the Indian foreign policy, or the influence of the Indian foreign policy in emerging world order. So, Professor, floor is yours now.
Thank you, Dr. Deepak. I'm very happy that you are chairing this session. It's my pleasure and my honor to make presentation. I do feel that while Professor Swaran Singh is there and Dr. Shahab Enam Khan is also there, so I do feel that I'm in JNU and we are basically we are doing this conference in JNU. That it gives me a feeling. So thank you very much. I also extend my thanks to Pramod. Of course, he's also be part of JNU. So it's an extended JNU family now in different countries. So thank you very much, Dr. Deepak. I would focus my since I'm looking at how what would be the new directions of India's foreign policy in new normal. What are the continuity and what would be the changes in near future that would take place? So I would discuss these aspects into two different aspects. So one, you can say the structural aspects, and in functional aspects, that how the India's foreign in post-COVID world order, and India being a largest democracy where you can see more than 700 to 800 people vote at a time, has definitely a strong credential before the world community. It's a rule-abiding country, and has while they are making the foreign policy, they have basically consider the different stakeholders at domestic front to make its foreign policy, and it is of course very much different from what the other extra regional powers, particularly China, takes decisions while they are making their foreign policy. They have more over the top-down approach rather than having a bottom-up approach, where India being a largest functional democracy has very much the opinion of different stakeholders while they are making its foreign policy. Of course, that India's credentials and ethos of secularism that makes it a largest power in the world is also very to its foreign policy. Of course, India is also it's advanced to economy and a military power, particularly after becoming a nuclear power. It has been recognized. So, what would be the focus in new normal? I am going to focus. I do find there are three clear-cut policy directions that India is taking and would I think would continue in future. First, it is well articulated by the scholars that developing a strategic partnership with the United States for considering its geo-economic and geostrategic interest in India, in South Asia, and of course in Indo-Pacific region. But I would say that I think this is not a new direction in a way, because I do find from 1947, 1948 onward, while Nehru Nehru was the Prime Minister of India, India always tried to have very close proximity with United States. The first visit Nehru took, that was US, but US did not basically entertain in a way what it entertained Pakistan and Turkey for a while, because Nehru was not in mood to work on the terms and conditions what the United States wanted to impose on India. So India tried always in even 1962, and then in 1971 crisis, India went to United States. Indira Gandhi went to the United States and tried to align with US and asked to intervene while there were crises in Pakistan, Bangladeshi people asking for an independent state. So, but the shift had been taken place while India had become a nuclear power and had started emerging as an economic power in late 90s, or you can say in 21st century. And there I do find very interesting aspects that India and United States had come closer in last 2 decades, but and very significant agreements had been signed, particularly that 2005 nuclear deal, and in 2016 we have gone for the logistic agreement with United States. But I would submit one very significant point, that this is all Western scholars discourse that India had developed close proximity with United States, but it's not. I think that United States had started taking interest in India or in South Asia, and in the United States found India more convenient, more suitable for its interest in Asia and Indo-Pacific region. And United States changed its policy, made it sit in its policy, and developed close proximity with India and asking India to act in Southeast Asian countries or Indo-Pacific region, as well as in South Asia, particularly in the issue of Afghanistan. Trump had indicated that India should do more in its efforts. So my point is that India, it is United States that found India more important, more strategically more significant, geoeconomically more significant country in Asia, and started aligning. Of course, China, balancing China is one of the factor for India as well as and United States. So there is conversion of interest between the two countries on issue of terrorism, on issue of China, on issue of or other geostrategic and economic alliances between the two countries. The second, I do find that India is shaping its foreign policy in a way that how to cope with rise of China, and that is a big question before all the policymakers in India. This is highly debated, that how to cope with rise of China. China is an emerging world power, is an economic power, and it's a military power. Some do find that China is a threat to many of the neighboring countries, including India. Some of the scholars, they talk that no, China is an opportunity for the neighboring countries and the Asian countries, and we should align with China, we should entertain China by different different projects what the Chinese has proposed, like Belt and Road initiatives and all that. India, from the very beginning, particularly from Rajiv Gandhi period, you do find that India tried to develop a foreign policy that we would engage ourselves economically and politically, and because of that policy, the bilateral trade between India and China had reached about $95 billion. Though we have a huge trade imbalance with China, but there another understanding had been developed that India would adopt a policy of status quo on border issues, that we would not basically encroach, and we will believe in the principles of coexistence. So that kind of policy had been adopted by India and China. But in the recent past, we do find, particularly in last 4-5 years, the issue of Doklam and Ladakh, we do find that China is not stuck on the policy of status quo on border, maintaining peace and transparency on border issues. And what I do find in further that the two countries, they have basically moreover engaged in a way to balancing each other in different regions or in each other's region. And I do find that how the Chinese are coming to South Asian countries, they are building different ports, they are building different infrastructures, investing in Sri Lanka, investing in Bangladesh, in Maldives, in Nepal. The way and India is not joining them, and particularly where the Chinese are investing in China-Pakistan economic corridor that passes through the disputed land that Pakistan occupied Kashmir, and that India has a serious sovereignty issues and serious objections to that China, and it irritates the relations between these two countries. But not only in South Asia, we are going to the other parts of the world, particularly in Southeast Asian countries, where in South China Sea or in Vietnam, India wanted to invest in oil sector. The China has objections that it is a disputed areas. So and India had a hard competition in Vietnam, in Myanmar, and of course in West Asian countries as well. So there is an issue. This would continue, that how to cope with the rise of China in this new normal. But the third very important point, what I try to touch here, is that the third policy shift I do find in India's, and that would take place. That would be very crucial, very important, that India's neighborhood policy and India's South Asia policy. That I'm going to focus much about that. India's strategic alliance with the United States and India's concerns and India's engagement with China in policy in its policy. We are very much familiar that we are part of common ecological system. We say common heritage, culture, tradition, history, and we have civilizational affinities, though we are politically divided. But this is one of the most or least integrated region in the world. So being this close proximity, being an Indo-centric region, that there are very significant, very important factors that distance the neighbor, and that comes the structural aspects of India's foreign policy or India's neighborhood policy. And I do find there is a asymmetry in real power of the region in keeping the size and economy and the military of India, and while dealing with the neighboring countries. And that asymmetry gives an apologetic behavior to the neighboring countries, that if India doesn't, if India is not an opportunity, if India is a military power, then we should develop, we should find an opportunity, and we should align with the extra regional powers. And there China comes in this post Cold War period, you can say. And all the countries, they are trying to align economically and militarily with China. So this is one structural aspect that creates or distance the neighboring countries in South Asia. And of course, there are legacies that South Asian countries carry and distance each other. Particularly, what I saw, the partisan of 1947 and the partisan of 1971, and this partisan is basically unfinished partisan. There are a lot of problems, and that creates mistrust and differentiating threat perceptions among the South Asian countries between India and.
You that you have 3 minutes remaining, sir.
Oh, okay. So I do find that India now keeping this entire in South Asia in mind, and keeping entire the new in the pandemic, that what are the new normals, what India is going to emphasize in its foreign policy, that there will be first functional aspects would be that India will enhance or give more emphasis to its economic diplomacy and try to cultivate, build a strong supply chain, try to have more investment from different corners of the world, and will try to mobilize the Indian origin people, or you can say Indian diaspora, to invest in India. So that would be the first functional area that India would cultivate, would work to have more investment, more market-oriented economy. Second, India would very consciously will develop military diplomacy, or develop the strategic partnership. Already India has strategic partnership with 37 countries, but now what the way India is giving indications, asking Malabar exercise, and so it is an indication that India may join Quad, not purely an strategic purpose, but for economic purpose as well. So this would be the second SIP. The third would of course would be that India would emphasize to use soft power strategy in a way to make more credentials in the world, where get more support on the issues of terrorism, get more support in the issues that developments taking place in South Asian countries, particularly on issue of China. And there India would try to develop a democratic alliance with the democratic countries, where Modi had started while he visited to Japan and asked to have a democratic alliance. So that India would focus more on democratic alliance. And fourth, it would be the organizational changes would take place with the Indian foreign policy making. It would be more, I think, more prime minister centric foreign policy. India, I think what India would further emphasis on the four policy areas with the neighboring countries, so that you can develop closer relations with the neighboring countries. I'll take only 2 minutes to explain it, and then I can answer that. Where India tried to have a reciprocal relations with the neighboring countries, but it would emphasize, it would further the policy of Gujarat, where he introduced non-reciprocity with the neighboring countries, keeping the developments in neighboring countries are taking place in Bangladesh, in Nepal, in Sri Lanka. Of course, India would also emphasize on constructive unilateralism, that we should do more in for the developments of the neighboring countries. We should extend more economic assistance to the neighboring countries, to Bangladesh, to Nepal, so that you can minimize whatever the deep pockets are coming from China and all that. Third would be, of course, India would emphasize on multilateralism rather than the bilateralism with the region, so that you can have more multilateral or you can say multi-aligned groups to advance the Indian interest. And fourth, India would emphasize on the resource sharing formula rather than the resource nationalism formula. So these are the major trends that India's foreign policy would take place. But how the neighboring countries would respond to the India's foreign policy, that is a question. I'll just submit one question. While India is becoming India has given largest line of credit to Bangladesh. It is around $8 billion line of credit had been given. Still, Bangladesh is looking China as an opportunity, asking Chinese to invest in the sensitive zones like building Silat airport, and asking China to invest in Tista issues. So I think India has to keep in mind these developments to minimize the Chinese investment and to address the grievances that the neighboring countries have, like in Bangladesh, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor Sanjay, for your very intensive presentation. And what we see that in its foreign policy making process, how India is looking at the emerging world order in post-pandemic, though humanity has traveled many pandemics, but in the modern world now we are looking how emerging emerging powers, or economic powers like India, is looking the changing world order and taking its step to reshape or the shape its for reorient its foreign policy. And while earlier we have seen that, in the East Asia it was talking about the look east policy, now it's act east policy. Many connecting points are there, investments are there. Similarly, it's working on West Asia part. So this is how India is searching its new partnership in the Quad and making its relation with China, vis-a-vis US in terms of Indo-Pacific strategy and all these things. So we'll be talking in a few moments in that. Now, Professor Shahab Enam Khan, a prolific scholar on the South Asian context, and he is going to talk on how the regional cooperation will take a shape in the upcoming world order in the post-pandemic scenario, and in South Asia especially. Though we have a BIMSTEC, we have a BBIN, we have a BCIM on the other part. From Chinese side, China is investing in CPEC form, and Hamad Dotakis is must talk. So these are the situations, how and what are the prospects in this context. So a good friend of mine, we have been sharing forums and talking in many places together, but it's my pleasure to give floor to the Professor Shahab.
Thank you, Dr. Bhatt. At the onset, I must mention that Professor Sanjay Bhardwaj is not only your supervisor, but my supervisor too. So he has been the kindest supervisor that we can always think of, who has aptly and sincerely guided us to our excellence in terms of our studies and the degree. And henceforth, I think he deserves an extra thanks from both Professor Dr. Bhatt, myself, and of course Pramod. And I'm quite sure the accumulation of wealth that will be generated, wealth of knowledge that will be generated from this session should be attributed to Professor Bhardwaj, because this is where the whole genesis of academic tolerance, academic diversity, and of course academic understanding comes in. So thank you, Dr. Bhatt, and thank you, Professor Bhardwaj. Let me start with two very critical points from JNU. In the Energy Studies program, there was a greater initiative to study energy cooperation across the region, and it was spearheaded by Professor Bhardwaj, which not only includes the South Asian countries, but also the Southeast Asian countries. And that's perhaps one of the very interesting output that came from Professor Bhardwaj's research is the energy community and South Asian energy community, or cross South Asian or Pan-Asian energy community. And that's precisely where the multilateralism comes in. And Professor Bhardwaj has obviously touched upon the very critical issue of multilateralism, which is, of course, a critical factor too. And I must also say, Professor Swaran Singh has rightly mentioned that what Sanjay envisaged and understood in terms of security, in terms of geography, in terms of mapping, is perhaps slightly different than what Beijing is thinking. And I think this is a very important finding that Professor Singh has brought out. And that's the reason we also have to understand that the quite aggressiveness, or perhaps if aggressiveness is not the right word, perhaps the proactive presence of China, and in the vacuum of multilateralism and the vacuum of intra-regional trade, is perhaps something that we are going to see in the long run if we don't really address it. And even the vaccine issue, which has been now much debated, has another dimension, which is a vaccine nationalism versus vaccine internationalism. And we can perhaps see that Trump administration has pulled out itself from WHO, certainly gives much more greater leverage to the European Union countries as well as China to assume the leadership. And perhaps Dr. Singh has also mentioned one very critical factor, that how Chinese leadership in multilateralism is gaining. Even if you look at the post COP21, even the lack of interest from Washington has obviously given preference for other countries to assume leadership, and Beijing is not exceptional. And obviously, in line with what Professor Bhardwaj has said, and of course you have mentioned, and obviously I bring the ambassador's point of view, is very important. Look at the new financial architecture growing up or becoming as an alternative to the Bretton Woods, such as the World Bank and IMF. AIIB is there. Now the Chinese have created a number of initiatives, including new development bank, contingent reserve arrangement, new Silk Road Fund, and whatnot. So these are all creating an alternative to the long existing ideas of Bretton Woods. So you're now going to see a new kind of financial architecture emerging in the post-COVID world. And even if you look at now that the Chinese have a similar model of USAID or DFID, UK government's something called China Development Cooperation Agency. So you're also seeing that the development agenda, which has long been pursued by the Western countries, are now being filled in by the Chinese government. So these are the hardcore reality that is coming up in front of us. And obviously taking cue from Professor Bhardwaj, even if you look at SAARC, I mean, Prime Minister Narendra Modi of India has taken a lead after 6 years of break in SAARC's regular activities. And he convened a regular meeting, as an online meeting for all the stakeholders to come in. And he has actually mentioned the urgency to fight the COVID-19 situation. And COVID-19 situation is not going to go away anytime soon. And such a pandemic will once and possibly will come back with the new viruses being found in Siberia, in Antarctica, and where not. So that's going to be a very important denominator for the South Asians to rethink their multilateralism, because one, COVID has showed that even ICU beds and everything is insufficient. So where are we going to put our money into? So there is also, even Pakistan came up with four pillar provision. Afghanistan talked about telemedicine. Bangladesh has lent its support to everyone. And obviously, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Bhutan's leadership has strongly reiterated their support for collective effort in that particular virtual meeting. So that gives a great hope that the SAARC will eventually be an important factor in the multilateral discussion. Same is BIMSTEC. Even if you take these two institutions, I mean, for Bangladesh-Myanmar relationship, where Rohingya refugee issue is a big concern for Bangladesh, and India's current state of relationship with Pakistan and Nepal all comes within the bracket of both SAARC and BIMSTEC. And perhaps this is why we all have to be very serious about SAARC and BIMSTEC. And obviously, if you take the case of lack of intra-regional trade, less than 5% compared to ASEAN, even the African Union, unity, and altogether our rate of intra-regional trade is so low that it is natural for any extra-regional or entities to come and invest over here in the absence of these trade regimes. Now, even if you take BIMSTEC, SAARC, once again, SAARC was coined by Bangladesh and is now being hosted by Kathmandu. And you are sitting in a very important place where SAARC headquarters is situated. BIMSTEC's headquarters is situated in Dhaka. So these are all very close to the heart of the political leaderships across the region, including, of course, India. Now, Nepal and Bhutan's access to Bay of Bengal, Bangladesh's access to electricity in Nepal and Bhutan, India's access to Northeast India through Bangladesh transit, and everything is now falling into pieces, and everybody is now becoming much more unified than ever. What we need is to bolster the process as soon as possible. Even if we look into the very important factor of the case of regionalism, and regionalism's basic premise is always trade. So therefore, we go back to the whole idea of trade, investment, financial regime, and perhaps this is a high time to look for the South Asian regional economic framework to be revived, and then accordingly to work. The question again for Bangladesh and India and Myanmar, even Thailand has come up, that how we are going to ethically exploit the resources in Bay of Bengal and Indian Ocean. For all these things, again, we will need new standards, new norms, which is fundamentally becoming different than the existing international law, international norms and standards. This is another factor for recovery of the economy, at least for Bangladesh, that much I know, that staggering $13.3 billion loss has to be recovered this way or the other. And perhaps Bay of Bengal's exploitation of resources and ethically environmental friendly way is one of the way for Bangladesh to move ahead. And this is the same case for not only Bangladesh, but also for Myanmar and West Bengal and below. So again, the whole idea of how are we going to, because if we exploit the resources in Bay of Bengal, obviously the implication will be in the side of the Indian maritime boundary and of course Myanmar's maritime boundary. So we have to come to some sort of consensus, even as Professor Bhardwaj's reports found that even if you want to have an energy community, you have to have your own standards. So these standards have to be built in consensus with all the stakeholders over here. Even if you look at the economic crisis, I mean, our economic crises are pretty much same. If the Middle East goes volatile, there is a serious problem of remittance flows in Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Nepal, and whatnot. And that's exactly, we need to have some sort of protection mechanism in the case of falling of the remittances coming in. Even if you look at poverty, if you look at health, economic recovery, as I mentioned earlier, all falls into the one bucket in the post-COVID world, and we have to manage it collectively. If we don't manage it collectively, certainly the cheaper goods coming from anywhere, whether it is China, whether it is Central Asia, whether it's Africa, is something that we will have to bear with, and that's the international trade, and that's how the international trade would look like. Even if I go back to a very hardcore security stuff, even if you take it from all the way from Afghanistan to the Himalaya to Naga Hills to all the way to Myanmar, you can now see that the politics of border is once again coming back. And the politics of border, recalibration of map, everything is going on, whether in a right way or a wrong way, or in terms of it is through the conventions or following international order, that is immaterial at the moment, showing that the countries are now willing to bypass the existing norms for resource nationalism. And perhaps that is where the nationalism comes in. So we have to be very, very careful about that particular regime rising. And we will be seeing the same protectionism coming in the European Union, where the ultra-right and rights are demanding for a recalibration of European Union, asking for new nationalism, protectionism, anti-migrant issues. And there is also an evidently published by the media, European media, showing that the racism is also in the rise. So that is also a new reality. In that reality, how we are going to ensure migration regimes, new compliances in terms of international trade, new compliances in terms of international customs, and so on will come up. So we have to be extremely prepared about it. And hence this arc of instability starting from all the way Afghanistan down to Rakhine, is perhaps would require a collective approach. And if we go for bilateral solutions for all these things, obviously the result will come much slower than ever that we can always imagine. So given all this gamut of changes, given all this gamut of uncertainty, and given all these changes in terms of international norms, standards, and practices, perhaps this is a high time when we always look forward to multilateralism and multi-stakeholderism. And perhaps all these issues should come from the bottom too. Because if you look at the tech giants coming up and how the social media is now eroding or challenging the monopoly of state over power or ideologies, or perhaps the very traditional idea of security, is something that we have to understand. Therefore, the youth, which means this youth actually makes South Asia much more younger than most of the regions. And this younger region or the younger economy or consumption pattern that is unfolding has to be taken into consideration, and we should look beyond our very old ideas of statist responses to diplomacy, foreign relations, negotiations, bargaining, or even the institutional regimes. Thank you, Dr. Bhatt.
Thank you, Professor Shahab and Khan, for your excellent presentation, and you have wrapped up in the given time. So thank to all scholars, those who have presented your views, a very excellent ideas for how this post-pandemic world order will be taking shape, and how the regional powers or the countries in the region will be looking to implement their policies. Thank you, Sahab. As you talked about, like how this multilateralism will be shaking in the days to come, and what are the challenges posed in terms of the traditional or security mindset and the newer security challenges. And at the same time, definitely the movement of the people, the migration trained, and of course the addressing these things from like democratic framework or any kind of that, and of course climate change issues, and most of the development issues which are very much related to the security concerns of states. And so I'm waiting for Paki or Dr. Pramod. Do you have collected some questions? Otherwise, I have only few questions, or one question asked to the Professor Bhardwaj here in the group chat. Others, if you have collected from YouTube or Facebook Live or in the chat room. Paki, do you have some questions?
There are few in chat box. We are pasting some more.
Can you pose these questions so we can have a?
There is one for Sanjay sir. It's there on the chat box.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Please allot us a minute or two. The questions will be right there.
Yeah, I've seen. Shall I answer, or you will read out the question?
Yeah, better. You don't need to read the questions, sir. Just let's go for what India will be.
I read one question.
Policy in terms of recent developments in India-China perspective. By the time we'll take other questions. Please go ahead, Professor Sanjay.
Okay, I can see one question is raised to me in this box. They're comparing with the Modi's foreign policy and Manmohan Singh's foreign policy, particularly with the neighboring countries. I do find that Manmohan Singh had basically extended the foreign policy what Gujarat was talking about, following the policy of non-reciprocity. But what he had added two very important points in his government. Of course, we had very good relations during Manmohan Singh government. But I do find that Modi had tried to activate in more enthusiastically with the neighboring countries and introduced neighborhood first policy. And that you see that while taking his first visit, he went to Bhutan and then went to Nepal and then Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. All the countries he tried to explore these countries and had an approach that let us develop together or try to bring all the neighboring countries into developmental port. But what happened that and of course I would categorically say that he tried to keep a very secular foreign policy, very objective foreign policy while developing relations with the neighboring countries. He tried to detach the domestic issues with the foreign policy and neighborhood policy issues, but it could not work well while the domestic issues had created a problem with the neighboring countries, particularly while I'm talking today in context of Bangladesh, that the two issues that NRC and Citizenship Act had adversely impacted in the mindsets of the people of Bangladesh, and they are not feeling very comfortable. The leadership is also very conscious about while they are dealing with India. In Nepal also, you can see we have mishandled the issue of blockade in 2015. So we could not do, and even in Sri Lanka also, while Sirisena came into power, we tried to develop very good relations, but you can't do everything what as per your wishes. But I would submit one very interesting point that Modi, while he came into power, he tried to cultivate Pakistan as well. He went to Pakistan even without without any agenda or an informal visit. And he tried to use the soft power diplomacy that we should come together, India and Pakistan, to fight against terrorism. We should resolve all the issues and let us go. But it could not go. And what happened finally, while it could not work out, that India had developed a strategy. India had a very significant shift from the Pakistan foreign policy, from soft power strategy to a hard power strategy, and had taken two steps to teach Pakistan. One was that deterrence by punishment. We punished Pakistan while they were cultivating the terrorism and terrorist activities. I'll just finish. Yeah. So deterrence by punishment, and then had surgical strikes, and another one like denial strategy that we will upgrade our borders, our intelligence services, that these issues could not repeat. Manmohan Singh had a bad time during Pakistan while we had Mumbai attack and all these issues. So I do find that yes, there are continuity of Manmohan Singh's foreign policy in Modi's foreign policy, but of course there are issues that the domestic issues could not detach from the with the neighboring countries in the foreign policy issues, and that had little bit disrupted the way. But I'm sure Bangladesh, India, Nepal, India, and Nepal, Sri Lanka, India, Sri Lanka, they will prosper together. They will have better understanding in near future. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Bhardwaj. We are running out of time, but we have one question for each. Professor Swaran Singh, a question is here for you: is that how you look at India-China clash in the context of Sun Tzu's theory or his contribution to the Chinese civilization? And so it will be good if you wrap up your answer within 3 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Bhatt. 3 minutes is a long time on online interactions. Sun Tzu obviously would look at it in terms of intersocietal, intercivilizational mindset contest between two civilizational states as we exist today. So if the Chinese are to be understood in terms of what they're doing vis-a-vis India, from Sun Tzu perspective, then I think we have to understand that Galwan Valley incidents of 15th June was an aberration, and therefore a complete silence from Chinese leadership in sharing any information about what happened from their side in terms of casualties or any other losses. Indeed, there is an enormous controversy since yesterday about a tombstone being found on Galwan, about a soldier from Fujian who apparently died on the Chinese side on June 15th, the Galwan clashes. So the complete silence from China on mentioning anything about even martyrdom. 30th September is the Chinese Martyrdom Day. So we don't know if Chinese will still recognize the martyrdom of their soldiers in Galwan Valley, simply because it's an aberration to them. They want to influence India and make India understand the asymmetric relationship that has evolved. So if you notice, starting from Deng Xiaoping period and visit of Rajiv Gandhi, two sides started ignoring the border and started saying, let us focus on areas where we can agree. And then from Wen Jiabao onwards, you started hearing there is enough space for China and India to grow in this world together, saying that two tigers can still live on the same hill. That was the chapter which has apparently come to end now, and we are moving into the next chapter. But Chinese are still pursuing that Sun Tzu civilizational mode. So as Sanjay was mentioning, you know, Sheikh Hasina still finds China more attractive. The lower of commercial projects is being used vis-a-vis all neighbors of India. Nepal is the latest fantastic example of Prime Minister's government being sustained by the help of Chinese. And the way Chinese ambassador, how Yanshi is being presented by media in Kathmandu is an excellent example of how Chinese would try to influence Maldives, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh. Of course, Pakistan is their most closest ally in the context. So Chinese would like to build an asymmetric relationship. Now the difference is that during Prime Minister Modi's period, and my last 30 seconds for this, during Prime Minister Modi's time, we are moving the next chapter from internalizing asymmetry to now standing up to China. And I think therefore the clash is taking a completely new picture between China and India. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor. Dr. Shambhu Simkhada, are you hearing me? There's a question for you, that what will be the new world order and who will lead it? Will it be led by, the new world order would be led, China-led world order? So you have 2 to 3 minutes, Dr. Simkhada.
Well, that obviously is the billion rupees question, you know, but that will depend on the nature of the coming paradigm, you know, global paradigm, which one prevails. That is why I have described the current global paradigm as a paradigm flux. You know, one paradigm, the Cold War paradigm of conflictual polarity, has ended. What is the nature of the new paradigm? Is it going to be again a unipolar post-World War II, post-Cold War order of the US being the unchallenged superpower in the world? Is it going to be a bipolar one? Or can the world transform itself to what I call a competitive and cooperative plurality? That in fact there are multiple sort of great powers coexisting, competing, but also coexisting. That's the question.
Thank you.
Let me conclude with one thing that, you know, because of the time I couldn't, and that is where I see the centrality of India. And of course, in the conversation this morning, the centrality of JNU, you know, I'm so delighted to be in the midst of almost the entire panel of JNU scholars and JNU alumni. So the point is, where I see the problem, we are all too familiar with the historic debate on realism and idealism as students and practitioners of IR. Oriental or Western, conventional or modern, you know, the interface between power and its use, its exercise, has preoccupied political wisdom and political action all over. But to just give you an example of how this confusion is prevailing, but did we know that Chanakya in ancient India, regarded as one of the earliest of the thinkers of statecraft, and of course the realist, and his Western counterpart Machiavelli, his Western counterpart, both converge on the use of power like this, where Machiavelli in his Prince says, and I'm quoting, "Yet it cannot be called prowess to kill fellow citizens, to betray friends, to be treacherous, pitiless, irreligious. These ways can win a prince power, but not glory." And that precisely echoes what Chanakya and his Niti, famous counsel, ahara nindra bhayamai thunani, samani chaitani nidam pasunam, jnanam narana madiko viseso,
Thank you, Dr.
Samana.
Thank you, Dr.
So, you know, the post-COVID-19 world is a tiny virus. We still don't know how it came up, how much it will affect, is turning the classical notions of power, useless, powerless. So that is why we need a fundamental transformation in the way we think. And that is where I think, Professor Khan, those of us who have white hairs now will debate this issue. But who will bear the consequences of this new paradigm is the youth. And that is what I found very interesting. And hope that is where I see the centrality of India, in the sense that India will be under pressure from both sides. And what India decides to do, I think, will determine the nature of the coming global paradigm. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Simkhada. And question for Professor Khan, how you look at regionalism or the sub-regionalism. After the failure of SAARC, the BIMSTEC is in the scenario. So what do you think that is, if BIMSTEC fails, will India be held responsible for the failure of regionalism in the Southeast Asia? Is the question pointed to you, Professor Khan. You have 2 to 3 minutes to wrap up your ideas.
I will just wrap it up in 2 minutes. First of all, let us get our narratives first. The first thing is SAARC is not failure. What we can always argue that it is slow and it requires reform. Had it been a failure, none of these countries would have sent their directors to sit in Kathmandu. So there is an understanding within the countries that today or tomorrow SAARC will have to be revived. So that's number one. Number two is that it has limitations. Now this limitation has to be removed. Bilateral talks should be allowed, institutional reforms could be done, and eventually all the countries, if I take Narendra Modi's initiative of virtual conference, that gives you a clear understanding. Even if you look at the Prime Minister of Nepal or Prime Minister of Bangladesh or Prime Minister of Sri Lanka, everybody is now strongly talking about it. So it is a matter of time how we can bolster the process of SAARC and bring reform to it. The second thing is BIMSTEC is fairly a new institution. It sits between 2 regions of Southeast Asia and South Asia. So it also requires a little bit of reform. At least if not for Bangladesh only or India only, but also for Nepal and Bhutan to have a greater access to all the way to Southeast Asian markets. So that is exactly where we have to work on and bring essential expansion of BIMSTEC. Now, whether India shall be blamed or not, I mean, I won't say that India shall be blamed or any country as such shall be blamed for any kind of hostageness. I mean, whether it is Pakistan, India, or any country. The very simple, obvious reason is that the reforms were not essentially being driven by neither the private sector, nor the civil society, nor the academia, or perhaps even the state leaders or the domestic politics. Until or unless these things come up, I don't think any country should be blamed for its dormantness, or perhaps not moving forward to the desired output. Thank you.
Chair,
Shahab, thank you.
Chair, if 30 seconds.
Yeah, please, Professor. Please, Swaran Singh.
To make a small mention, my very dear friend, Ambassador Simkhada, is like elder brother to me. I respect his scholarship enormously. But I thought, since I am from New Delhi, I must mention the comparison with Machiavelli, I think, is extremely limiting to Kautilya. Scholars around the world have done that comparison and often have come to conclusion that Kautilya talks about dharma yuddha. His ethics is not secular or political ethics. So Machiavelli tries to create an autonomous template of ethics which has its own grammar, whereas Kautilya is still contesting within the Brahminical culture of ancient India. So I think it's a slight distinction that makes Kautilya much wider, bigger, deeper, and relatively Machiavelli much more contemporaneous and allow me to say superficial. So I am one of those people who believes comparing Kautilya to Machiavelli is extremely limiting Kautilya. And I was saying enormous things about Sun Tzu, but I think Sun Tzu would be a better comparison with Kautilya, because both of them represent a civilizational ethos and are not focusing on contemporaneous immediate issues on the platter. With apologies to my elder brother, I thought I must mention this point of view.
Thank you, Professor. We will keep sharing.
Dr. Bhatt, can I just make one 30-second comment?
Okay. But limited to
I absolutely agree. In fact, there's no point of disagreement in the sense that that is the reason why I said, India will pay the centrality, because, to be a great power, you need the other paraphernalias of power. You need a big economy, you need military power, you need big population, geography, and so on. But you also need the power of ideas that others feel to emulate. And that is where I see the problem today, in the sense that China and India have now, America, have placed themselves on the two polarity of both other elements of power, but also in terms of the notion of governance, in the type of politics. So in that sense, I absolutely agree that with wisdom like Kautilya's, I only quoted, in the sense that they have to support my idea of the exercise of judicious exercise of power, and to look at different elements of power in the classical, international discourse on realism versus idealism.
Thank you.
That was the only thing. Otherwise, I agree with you absolutely.
Thank you.
In fact, Kautilya has a much larger vision of statecraft than the counsel that Machiavelli gave to his prince. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you, my gurus, and thank you, friends. Thank you, Dr. Pramod, NIICE and WPC for organizing this webinar and, making all this possible in the COVID era, and where we are talking about the post-COVID era and, after pandemic, how the world order will be, and the world strategies are converging or diverging. And as I mentioned at the beginning, that Huntington talked about the clash of civilizations. Slightly we are calling the clash of development models. At the same time, we are revisiting Sun Tzu, 500 BC, Thucydides, again 500 BC, Kautilya, 300 BC, and Gautam Buddha for peace and tranquility, 500 BC. So this is where we all have in our mind, for the greater cause of the humanity, how we will be moving, how we will be looking, the world order, world strategies, and all these things. In a greater context, you all have contributed excellent ideas. And what I see is, yes, when we talk about the geopolitical or geo-economic or the geo-civilizational notions, we'll be talking about the larger, the population of the world humanity. And as I mentioned briefly, yes, there are other sessions we'll be talking about the migration, employment, climate change, all these issues, but traditional and the non-traditional notions of security are very related with this very post-pandemic world order. So I think the organizers have rightly, placed this idea of post-pandemic world order and requested prolific scholars from South Asia to speak in with frank mind. So I will thank again the organizers, and thank you all panelists and the participants and those who have raised the questions. So I'm honored here. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot. I hope that I'm audible.
Yes, yes.
Yes, you are audible.
So distinguished chair, speakers, ladies and gentlemen, with this we come to the end of this session. I take great honor in proposing the word of thanks on behalf of NIICE to all those who have contributed in this event to make it a resounding success. We would like to express our sincere gratitude and thank Dr. Deepak Prakash Bhatt for agreeing to chair and moderate the session today. Our sincere thanks also goes to all the speakers for being a part of the event and delivering such comprehensive and convincing presentations in a very short time period provided to them. From discussing about Sun Tzu, Indian foreign policy, to discussing about the regional cooperation, I personally felt that the discussion was very much enthralling. It undoubtedly felt like diving into the blues of international relations with every presentation that was given by speakers. We would like to acknowledge our gratitude to our friends from diplomatic community, experts, academia, media, and different organizations. Finally, I cannot forget to thank our audience, because they've been the ones who have been giving us the questions, and they are the ones who have participated in the webinar so well. People who have been watching our YouTube channel, thank you for your valuable time and attention and for making this session productive with your questions. We're truly honored to have you all with us this morning and hope to stay connected with all of you in future as well. It's been a pleasure. Also, do join us in our next session. Thank you.